Welcome to today's deep dive. We're heading out into the vast world of astronomy.
To infinity and beyond.
Haha, pretty much. But more specifically, we're going to check out the Gskyer telescope on Amazon,
Oh yeah, I've seen that one.
the 70mm aperture, 400mm focal length one.
With the AZ mount, right?
Yeah, exactly, the classic refracting telescope.
Seems like everyone's starting out with that one these days.
For sure, lots of people are getting into stargazing.
It's a good one to start with for sure.
Definitely. And whether you're a newbie or you're looking for a gift for a future astronomer, we're going to see if this telescope really lives up to the hype.
Should be fun.
We've got the Amazon page pulled up, a ton of user reviews, even some info straight from the manufacturer.
Sounds like we're ready to go.
Let's do it. So right off the bat on that Amazon page, those specs, 70mm aperture, 400mm focal length AZ mount, what jumps out at you?
Well, I'd say for someone just starting out, that AZ mount is going to be a huge help.
Yeah, that's so special about it.
It stands for altazimuth mount, which basically means it just moves up and down and side to side.
Oh, so it's simple to use.
Super simple, makes it easy to point and find what you're looking for in the sky.
Gotcha. No getting tangled up in complicated movements.
Exactly.
Which is definitely a plus for beginners.
Huge plus.
But what about those numbers? 70mm aperture, 400mm focal length. What do those actually mean for what you can see through the telescope?
Okay, so let's start with aperture.
Okay.
Think of it like this: the bigger the aperture, the more light the telescope can gather.
Like a bigger bucket to catch rainwater.
Yeah, exactly. And more light means you can see fainter objects
Oh, I see.
and get more detail on the brighter ones.
So that 70mm aperture, is that considered big or small in the world of telescopes?
It's a decent starting point, especially for the price.
Okay.
You'll be able to see the moon's craters really clearly, maybe even make out the rings of Saturn.
Pretty cool.
Yeah, but if you're hoping to see really faint galaxies or nebulae, you might want to think about a larger aperture down the line.
Okay, good to know. So aperture is key. What about focal length, that 400mm number? How does that play into what you see?
Basically, focal length is the distance the light travels inside the telescope from the lens to the eyepiece.
Okay,
A longer focal length usually means you get higher magnification.
so you can zoom in more.
Exactly.
So with a 400mm focal length, can you give me an idea of the magnification we're talking about? Like, could I see the details on Jupiter's moons or something?
That's where the eyepieces come in.
Yeah.
This Gskyer comes with a 25mm and a 10mm eyepiece, plus a 3x Barlow lens.
What do those do?
They let you adjust the magnification. The 25mm gives you a wider view, good for bigger objects like star clusters.
Okay.
The 10mm zooms in further, and the Barlow lens triples the magnifying power of whichever eyepiece you're using.
Oh, wow. So you can really customize the view.
Yeah, there's a lot of flexibility.
So if I wanted to get a really close look at the moon, which combination would I use?
Probably the 10mm eyepiece with the Barlow lens. That'll
Yeah.
give you the highest magnification for all those lunar details.
It's like having different lenses for your camera. Okay, so we've covered the basic specs, aperture, focal length eyepieces. But on the Amazon page, I see this Gskyer gear also comes with a smartphone adapter and a wireless remote.
Oh yeah, those are great additions.
They seem pretty cool, especially for beginners.
Definitely. Imagine taking a picture of the moon through your telescope and showing it off to your friends.
Oh yeah, that would be awesome.
It's a really fun way to document your stargazing adventures.
I can already picture trying to get the perfect Instagram shot of the moon. Speaking of sharing experiences, let's see what other users are saying. The Amazon reviews are always interesting.
Totally, they can give you some really useful insights.
Right. And looking through the reviews for this Gskyer telescope, one thing that keeps coming up is how easy it is to assemble.
Oh, that's good to hear.
People are saying things like, it took me less than 30 minutes and the instructions were surprisingly clear. Seems like a big plus for someone who's just starting out.
For sure. You don't want to spend your first night wrestling with a complicated setup.
Yeah, no one wants that.
You just want to get out there and start exploring.
Exactly. Another thing I'm seeing a lot of positive comments about is the spherical accuracy of the lens.
Yes, that's important.
What does that mean exactly, and why is it so important?
So spherical accuracy basically means that the lens is shaped perfectly to get rid of any distortions.
Okay.
You know how sometimes when you look through a cheap magnifying glass, the image looks kind of wavy or bent?
Yeah, I've seen that.
Well, a spherically accurate lens stops that from happening. Make sure the image you see through the telescope is crisp and clear, true to life.
So no funhouse mirror effects in space.
Exactly.
Got it. And on a more practical note, a lot of reviewers are raving about the Gskyer's portability. They say it's compact and lightweight, easy to take camping, or to find a darker spot away from city lights.
That's a huge plus, especially if you live in an area with lots of light pollution.
Yeah.
Getting away from those city lights can make a huge difference in what you can see.
Oh, you just reminded me we need to talk more about light pollution later on. It seems like a real game changer for stargazing.
Absolutely. We'll definitely get into that.
Good to know. But before we get sidetracked by city lights, let's talk about the tripod. It's easy to overlook, but a good tripod is essential, right?
Oh, yeah. It's the foundation of your setup. A wobbly tripod will ruin your view faster than anything. And this Gskyer comes with a pretty solid one. It's adjustable, made from aluminum alloy, and even has a little tray for holding your eyepieces and stuff.
Oh, very nice. Keeps everything organized and within reach. Okay, so far it sounds like this Gskyer telescope has a lot going for it, especially for beginners. But are there any drawbacks or criticisms that keep popping up in the reviews? Nothing's perfect, right?
Well, you're right. There are always trade-offs. And one thing I've seen some people mention is the limitations of that smaller aperture,
Right.
especially when it comes to viewing those fainter objects.
So even though that 70mm aperture is good for getting started, it might not be enough for someone who really wants to see distant galaxies in all their glory.
Exactly. And we can talk more about what those larger apertures can show you when we get to the light pollution discussion.
All right, I'm definitely intrigued. It sounds like there's a whole world of possibilities beyond this 70mm aperture. But for now, let's stick with the Gskyer. I'm noticing a few reviews mentioning that the telescope is great for kids. Would you say this is a good choice for a young, budding astronomer?
Absolutely. It's lightweight, easy to use, and that smartphone adapter can really capture their imagination.
It's like a gateway to the universe.
It really is a great way to spark a lifelong passion for astronomy.
That's awesome. All right, so we've covered the basic specs, the user reviews, and even touched on a few potential limitations. But before we go any further, what's standing out to you so far? What's the most important thing for our listener to keep in mind about this Gskyer telescope?
I think the biggest takeaway is that this is a fantastic way to get started if you're curious about space. It's affordable, user-friendly, and gives you a great taste of what's out there. But it's important to remember that it's just the beginning. There's so much more to explore in astronomy.
So it's not about the destination, it's about the journey.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And this Gskyer seems like a perfect first step on that journey. Oh, and before I forget, I found something interesting about Gskyer, the company.
Oh yeah, what's that?
They've actually been designing optics for top brands for decades.
Seriously, so this isn't just some fly-by-night company?
Nope, not at all. They really know what they're doing when it comes to optics, and they're committed to quality, even with their more affordable products.
That's good to know. Add some credibility to this seemingly simple telescope. Okay, so we've got a solid foundation here. We know the basics of the Gskyer, what users are saying a bit about the company behind it.
Now we can get into the bigger picture, what aperture really means, how to handle light pollution, and choosing the right telescope for you.
Sounds like a plan. Let's dive in.
Okay, so we know aperture is like super important in a telescope. Bigger aperture equals more light. That means you get better views. But I think it would help to make that a little more concrete. Give some examples.
Totally, I'm with you there. So say I'm looking at the moon through this Gskyer with its 70mm aperture. What am I actually going to see? And then how would that change if I was using a telescope with like a 100mm aperture?
Okay, good question. So with the Gskyer, you'd get a really nice view of the moon's surface. Like the craters would be super sharp. You could see mountain ranges and those dark, smooth areas called Maria. It'd be pretty impressive.
Yeah, that already sounds amazing. But what about with the 100mm aperture? What extra details would I be able to see?
But with a 100mm aperture, you'd start to see even finer details, like those really thin channels on the moon. They're called rills. Those would become much more visible. And the level of detail inside the craters would increase too. You might even start to pick out individual mountains within a mountain range.
Wow. I'm starting to understand why people get so obsessed with aperture. It's not just about seeing more objects, it's about seeing more on the objects you're already looking at.
Exactly. And that difference becomes even more obvious when you're trying to see really faint objects like galaxies and nebulae. With a 70mm aperture, you might be able to detect some of the brighter ones, but they'll probably look faint and fuzzy. But with a larger aperture, those same galaxies and nebulae would be much more clear, with more detail and color. It all comes back to gathering more light.
Right, like that rainwater bucket analogy. Okay, that makes a lot of sense. So if our listener is serious about seeing those far away faint objects, a larger aperture is a must-have. But even then, there's another thing we got to think about, right? Light pollution?
Oh yeah, definitely. Light pollution can really mess up your stargazing. especially if you live in a city or the suburbs.
Yeah, it's kind of funny. You buy this telescope to see all these crazy things in space, and then your neighbor's porch light is like, nope, not tonight.
Yeah, it happens all the time. But don't worry, there are ways to deal with light pollution.
Okay, I'm all ears.
Yeah.
What can our listener do to fight back against those pesky city lights?
Well, the most obvious solution, even though it's not always the easiest, is to find a darker spot for viewing. Like even driving a little bit outside of the city can make a huge difference.
I'm imagining that classic stargazing scene, driving out to a field, setting up your telescope, and just being surrounded by darkness and stars.
It's the best. And there are websites and apps that can help you find those dark sky locations.
Oh, wow. So you can actually find spots with the least light pollution.
Yeah, exactly. They can pinpoint areas with minimal light pollution. So a little planning goes a long way.
Awesome. But what if you just can't escape the city lights? Are there any other options? I've heard of light pollution filters. Do those actually do anything?
Yeah, they can definitely help to some extent. Light pollution filters are designed to block out certain wavelengths of light that are common in artificial lighting, like from streetlights and stuff.
So they're like a shield for your telescope, blocking the bad light and letting in the good light from the stars.
Yep, you got it. But keep in mind, they're not a magic solution. They can definitely improve contrast and make some objects easier to see, but they won't completely get rid of the effects of light pollution.
Okay, so it's all about managing expectations. Even with a filter, you might not get that perfect dark sky experience if you're in the middle of a city. But hey, it's better than nothing, right?
For sure.
Yeah.
And remember, even if you can only see a few stars from your backyard, it's still pretty incredible to look up and connect with the vastness of space.
That's true. Every time I look at the stars, I'm just amazed by how huge everything is. It really puts things in perspective. Okay, so we've talked about aperture light pollution and ways to deal with it. It's starting to feel like choosing a telescope is way more complicated than just picking one out on Amazon.
There's definitely more to it than meets the eye, and I think this is a good time to bring it back to our listener and what they're looking for in their stargazing experience.
Yeah, because there's no one-size-fits-all answer when it comes to telescopes. It all depends on what you want to see and how you're going to use it.
Exactly. So listener, if you're out there thinking, okay, I'm interested in this whole stargazing thing, but where do I even begin? The first step is to ask yourself a few questions.
Like what kind of questions?
Well, first off, what are you most interested in seeing? Are you more into the planets in our solar system, or are you fascinated by those distant galaxies and nebulae?
Right, that makes sense. If you're all about those fainter deep sky objects, then aperture becomes super important.
Absolutely. And then there's the question of portability. Do you want a telescope you can easily take with you on trips to find those dark sky locations? Or will it mostly be staying in your backyard?
Portability is a big one for me. I love the idea of getting away from the city lights and finding a truly dark spot for stargazing.
And the Gskyer with its smaller size and carrying bag is definitely good for that. But if you're more of a backyard astronomer, you might care more about other features like a sturdier mount or maybe even computerized controls.
Yeah, it's all about finding the right balance for your needs. And let's be real, budget is a big factor too.
Oh, definitely. Telescopes can cost anywhere from a couple $100 to thousands of dollars. So it's important to set a budget and try to stick to it. You don't have to spend a fortune to have a great stargazing experience.
Especially when you're just starting out. No need to go all in on the fanciest model right away.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You can always upgrade later on as you get more into it.
Right. And don't forget, there are tons of resources out there to help you choose the right telescope, like astronomy clubs, online forums, even your local library can be really helpful.
Oh yeah, for sure. Those are great places to get more info.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. We talked about aperture light pollution, choosing the right telescope, even finding those dark sky spots. Now I'm feeling ready to actually go out and do some stargazing. Any practical tips for a first-timer?
Absolutely. First and foremost, dress warm. Even if it doesn't seem that cold, it can get chilly when you're standing still for a long time.
Yeah.
And bring a red flashlight. It'll help you see in the dark without messing up your night vision.
Red flashlight, got it. What about those star charts? I used to use them as a kid. Are those still a thing?
Yep. They're still super helpful, especially if you're just getting started. They'll help you navigate the night sky and figure out what you're looking at, like constellations and planets and stuff. You can get the classic paper charts, or there are tons of great apps for your phone or tablet.
Oh, those stargazing apps sound really cool. I can see myself out there with my phone identifying every star in the sky.
They're pretty awesome. And once you've found something you want to look at, take your time. Play around with different eyepieces to see it at different magnifications and really try to notice the details.
So patience is key here.
It definitely helps. Stargazing is all about slowing down and appreciating the view. And remember, There's always something new to discover up there, no matter how long you've been doing it.
All right, so we've gone through all the specs, navigated those user reviews, and even tackled those light pollution challenges.
We've covered a lot.
For sure. But now it's time for the big question, the one our listeners probably thinking. Is this the telescope for them? Is this Gskyer the one that'll launch their stargazing journey?
The big question. And like most things in life, it's not a simple yes or no. It really depends on what you, the listener, are looking for in your stargazing experience.
So let's break it down. Someone brand new to astronomy, never even looked through a telescope. Would you say that this Gskyer is a good place to start?
Oh, absolutely. For a beginner, it checks a lot of boxes. It's affordable, so you're not spending a ton of money before you even know if you're into astronomy. It's easy to set up and use, which is super important when you're just starting out. No one wants to be fumbling around with complicated equipment.
Right, you want to be out there exploring, not fighting with your telescope.
Exactly. Plus, with this Gskyer, you'll see some really cool stuff right away. Craters on the moon, the rings of Saturn, maybe even Jupiter's moons, if you've got good conditions.
Yeah.
It's enough to get you hooked and make you want to see more.
And those extra features like the smartphone adapter and the wireless remote, those seem like they'd make it even more fun, especially for a beginner.
Oh yeah, for sure. Being able to take pictures and share them with friends, that really adds to the experience.
Definitely. Okay, so for beginners, it's a thumbs up. But what about for someone who's already done some stargazing? Or someone who's really into those faint deep sky objects we talked about?
That's where those limitations we mentioned come in. That 70mm aperture, it's a great starting point. But it might not be enough if you're serious about those galaxies and nebulae. You probably want to upgrade to a larger aperture at some point.
And then there's light pollution. Even with a bigger aperture, if you're in a city with a ton of light, you're not going to see much.
Yeah, location is a big factor.
Yeah.
Got to be realistic about what you can see.
It's all about setting those expectations right. You might not see everything you want right away, especially with the light pollution.
Exactly. It's all part of the journey with astronomy. You learn more as you go, you upgrade your equipment, and you find those awesome dark sky spots.
And hey, even if you can only see the moon and planets, it's still pretty amazing. I mean, those are whole other worlds out there.
You're right. We get so caught up in the faraway stuff that we forget about the amazing things right in our own solar system.
So true. Okay, I think we've given our listener a lot to think about. We've looked at this Gskyer telescope from all sides, the good, the bad, and how it fits into the bigger picture of astronomy.
Hopefully they're feeling ready to decide if it's the right telescope for them.
And if it is, we've given them some tools and info to make the most of their stargazing.
Oh, before we wrap up, I wanted to leave our listener with one more thought. We've talked a lot about seeing things in space, but have you ever thought about experiencing astronomy through sound?
Astronomy